Extermination of Demons. A family's tragic fate. In a chilling village shrouded by ghostly horrors, the ill-fated union of two feuding families leads to unspeakable chaos. A young bride, Sarah, is married into the cursed Harlow family, unaware of the sinister forces at play. Her father's desperate warnings echo as the haunting begins. A clash of humanity and demonic entities unleashes wrath upon all involved. Amid the unfolding carnage, Sarah finds herself in the crossfire of betrayal, dark secrets, and a relentless battle for survival. As family members perish, a horrifying truth emerges: the marriage was a trap to end her lineage. With dramatic twists, the tale culminates in an intense showdown where love, revenge, and unspeakable terror collide. Will Sarah survive, or is her fate sealed by the sins of her ancestors? Part 1. The Curse of the Harlow Family. The wind howled through the narrow streets of Black Hollow, carrying with it a chilling promise of doom. The village was bathed in an otherworldly glow from oil lamps that flickered like dying souls. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, as if the very earth was conspiring against the living. Among the dim lights and suffocating silence, Sarah Westwood sat rigid in a creaky carriage, her heart pounding louder than the hooves striking the cobblestones. Sarah, her father, Edward, rasped, his voice laced with desperation. He leaned closer, his weathered hands trembling. "Listen to me. You must stay alert. The Harlows are not like us. They harbor darkness. Promise me you'll be careful." Sarah clutched her father's hand, feeling the strength that was quickly slipping from his grip. "Father, it's just a marriage. You've been warning me since the engagement was arranged. But they're people, like us." Edward's eyes, hollowed by worry, glistened under the pale moonlight. "No, Sarah, they are not. Victor Harlow is no ordinary man. This marriage was never meant for love or alliance. It's a trap." The words hit Sarah like a knife to the chest, sharp and cold. She wanted to argue, to question why her father hadn't stopped the arrangement if he believed it to be dangerous. But there was no time. The Harlow estate loomed ahead, its towering silhouette blotting out the stars. The gate creaked open, revealing the sprawling manor bathed in shadows. Gargoyle-like statues adorned the entrance, their grotesque features etched with sinister precision. The carriage came to a halt, and Sarah's mother, pale and silent throughout the journey, stepped down first, her face stiff with forced composure. Sarah followed, her dress brushing against the damp, moss-covered stones. A servant greeted them, his face devoid of warmth. "Miss Westwood," he said, his voice flat and unnerving. "Master Harlow awaits." Edward held Sarah's arm firmly, his strength returning for a fleeting moment. "We can leave now," he whispered. "No one will stop us if we turn back." But Sarah shook her head. Duty. Tradition. Fear, shame, they weighed heavily on her. She straightened her back, even as her hands quivered. "We've come this far, Father. Let's finish it." The servant led them into the grand hall, a cavernous space where shadows seemed to breathe. The chandeliers overhead dripped with wax like the tears of forgotten souls, casting strange patterns on the stone floor. Sarah's breath hitched as Victor stepped forward. Victor Harlow was a striking man, his features chiseled as if carved from marble. Yet, there was something unsettling in his eyes, a darkness that seemed to pull at the edges of the room. He smiled, but the expression didn't reach his gaze. "Welcome, Sarah," he said smoothly. His voice was like velvet lined with steel, sending a shiver down her spine. The ceremony began almost immediately. There were no joyous celebrations, no laughter, no music. Instead, the air was heavy with unspoken tension. Victor stood tall and imposing beside Sarah, reciting vows that felt more like a pact than a promise. The officiant, an old man with a voice that cracked like brittle bone, spoke in tones that echoed unnaturally. Sarah glanced at her father, standing among the few witnesses. His face was a mask of despair, his lips moving silently as though praying. Her mother's gaze was fixed firmly on the floor, refusing to look at her daughter or the man who would soon claim her. When the ceremony ended, a deafening silence filled the hall. Victor took Sarah's hand, his grip firm and cold. "You're mine now," he murmured, his words carrying a weight that made her stomach churn. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Servants moved like specters, guiding Sarah to her new chambers. The room was lavish but cold, the air thick with a metallic scent that set her teeth on edge. As the heavy door shut behind her, she felt utterly alone. She wandered the room, her fingers trailing over the ornate furnishings. There were no mirrors, no personal touches, only a foreboding stillness. Sarah's mind raced with her father's warnings. The Harlows harbor darkness. What did he mean? And why had he not fought harder to stop this? A knock at the door broke her thoughts. A maid entered, her eyes downcast. "Your evening gown, miss," she said softly, placing a crimson dress on the bed. Sarah frowned. "I didn't ask for this," the maid flinched, her voice barely above a whisper. "Master Harlow insisted." It is tradition. Before Sarah could respond, the maid fled, leaving her alone once more. As Sarah changed into the gown, unease settled deep in her bones. The fabric felt heavy, almost suffocating, and the color reminded her of blood. She stared at the door, expecting Victor to enter at any moment, but the night stretched on in oppressive silence. Finally, exhaustion claimed her. She lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, where faint carvings seemed to twist and writhe in the dim light. Her father's words played over and over in her mind. This is not a haven, it is a trap. And somewhere in the shadows of the Harlow estate, a low, guttural laugh echoed, as if the walls themselves were alive and reveling in her arrival. Part 2. A bride's unease. The flickering candles along the corridor cast trembling shadows that danced like restless spirits on the cracked, ancient walls. Sarah walked hesitantly, her footsteps muted by the thick, tattered carpet that stretched endlessly beneath her feet. The Harlow mansion, though grand in its architecture, exuded a sense of desolation. It was as if the air itself carried whispers of forgotten screams, and every creak of the floorboards hinted at unseen eyes watching from the darkness. Her gown, heavy with embroidery, dragged against the floor as she followed the maid assigned to lead her to her chambers. The young woman moved with mechanical precision, her posture unnaturally stiff, her gaze firmly fixed on the ground. Sarah tried to engage her, eager to break the suffocating silence. "What is your name?" Sarah asked softly. The maid flinched, her hands tightening around the brass handle of the lantern she carried. After a long pause, she murmured, "Anna, ma am." Sarah noticed the tremor in her voice, the way her shoulders seemed to shrink inward, as though she were bracing herself against an unseen threat. "Anna, do you live here in the mansion?" she asked, hoping to draw her out. Anna hesitated, her lips parting as though to speak, but she quickly pressed them shut. She only nodded once before quickening her pace, her movements jerky, almost frantic. Sarah's unease deepened. The walls seemed to close in around her as they walked. Ornate tapestries hung like silent witnesses, their once vivid colors faded to muted, ghostly tones. Intricate carvings of grotesque faces adorned the wooden paneling, their hollow eyes staring down at her with an unsettling intensity. The scent of decay grew stronger, metallic and cloying, clinging to her nostrils no matter how she tried to ignore it. "Is that smell?" Sarah paused, struggling to find the right words. "Is it normal here?" Anna stiffened but didn't reply. Instead, she stopped abruptly in front of a large, imposing door at the end of the hallway. The lantern's dim light barely illuminated the intricate carvings on the door, vines twisted together in an almost suffocating embrace, forming shapes that resembled faces screaming in agony. "This is your room," Anna whispered, her voice barely audible. She placed the lantern on a small table near the door and turned to leave without waiting for a response. "Wait," Sarah called out, her voice sharp with sudden panic. "What aren't you telling me?" Anna froze, her back to Sarah. For a moment, the maid stood completely still, her shoulders heaving with shallow breaths. Finally, she turned her head just enough for Sarah to see the glint of her tear-filled eyes. "Stay in your room tonight," Anna whispered hoarsely. "No matter what you hear, don't open the door." Before Sarah could respond, Anna hurried away, disappearing into the shadows. Sarah stood frozen in the corridor, her pulse quickening. Her father's warnings echoed in her mind. They harbor darkness. This place is not what it seems. The room itself was cold and unwelcoming, despite its opulence. A massive 4-poster bed dominated the space, its dark velvet drapes hanging like funeral shrouds. A single candelabra burned on the bedside table, its weak light barely penetrating the oppressive gloom. The walls were lined with shelves filled with old, leather-bound books, their spines cracked in titles obscured by layers of dust. Sarah walked to the window, hoping for some sense of normalcy, but the view offered no comfort. The grounds were shrouded in mist, the skeletal branches of ancient trees reaching skyward like pleading hands. Somewhere in the distance, a low, mournful sound carried on the wind. It might have been the call of an animal, but it chilled her to the bone nonetheless. She turned away from the window and tried to compose herself. "It's just a new place," she whispered aloud, as though speaking the words would make them true. "I'll get used to it." But her resolve wavered as she began to notice details she had missed before. The faint, rust-colored stains on the edge of the carpet, the scratches on the wooden floor near the door, the mirror above the vanity, covered with a heavy cloth as though someone had deliberately hidden it. A soft knock at the door startled her, and she jumped. Her throat tightened as she approached cautiously. "Who is it?" she called, her voice trembling. There was no response, just the knock, again 3 deliberate, measured taps. Sarah hesitated, Anna's warning ringing in her ears. "Don't open the door." She stepped back, her heart hammering, and decided to ignore it. But the knocking didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, until the entire door rattled in its frame. "Leave me alone," Sarah shouted, her voice cracking with fear. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of her ragged breathing. Hours passed, though sleep eluded her. Sarah sat curled on the bed, clutching a blanket tightly around her shoulders. She thought of her parents, the comforting familiarity of her childhood home, and the cruel distance that now separated her from safety. Every sound in the room seemed amplified: the groan of the wooden beams, the faint rustle of the drapes, the rhythmic ticking of the old clock on the mantel. At some point, exhaustion overtook her. Her eyes drifted shut, but her dreams were no reprieve. In her mind, she saw shadowy figures standing in the corners of her room, their faces obscured but their eyes burning like embers. She heard whispers, fragmented and unintelligible, growing louder until they drowned out her thoughts. Sarah jolted awake, her chest heaving. The candelabra had burned out, leaving her in near total darkness. Only the faint glow of moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting pale streaks across the room. Something was wrong. The air felt heavier, thicker, as though it were pressing down on her. The scent of decay was stronger now, almost suffocating. She reached for the candelabra, her fingers trembling, but froze when she heard a soft, dragging sound coming from outside the door. Her breath caught in her throat. The sound grew louder, closer, until it stopped just outside her room. She could hear the faint rasp of labored breathing, low and guttural, like an animal struggling for air. Suddenly, the door handle rattled violently, as though someone or something was trying to force its way inside. Sarah scrambled back onto the bed, clutching a pillow to her chest as if it could protect her. "Go away," she screamed, her voice breaking. "Leave me alone." The handle stopped moving, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, a deep, guttural laugh echoed from the other side of the door, a sound so inhuman it made her blood run cold. The laugh faded, followed by the faint sound of footsteps retreating into the distance. When dawn finally broke, Sarah was still awake, her body rigid with fear. The sunlight streaming through the window did little to ease her nerves. She knew, without a doubt, that something was deeply wrong in the Harlow mansion. And as she gazed at the door, still locked but marked with deep, fresh scratches, she realized she was no longer certain she would survive her first night as a Harlow bride. Part 3. A sinister revelation. The morning after her restless night, Sarah awoke to an unsettling stillness. The sunlight streaming through the thick curtains felt muted, as though it were reluctant to penetrate the darkness that seemed to cling to the mansion. Her body ached from tension, and her mind was clouded with fragments of the previous night: unearthly sounds, whispered warnings, and the bone-deep fear that had taken root in her soul. A knock at the door jolted her upright. This time, it was a servant, a man with sunken cheeks and hollow eyes. "Breakfast is served in the dining hall," he said, his tone devoid of warmth. Sarah hesitated, her instinct screaming that something was wrong, but she pushed herself to rise. "Be strong," she told herself. "If there is danger, I need to see it for what it is." The dining hall was a cavernous room dominated by a long oak table. At its center sat Victor, his pale hands resting on the polished wood. He looked up as Sarah entered, his lips curving into a smile that felt more predatory than welcoming. "Good morning, my dear," he said smoothly, gesturing for her to sit beside him. The table was laden with an extravagant spread, steaming meats, fresh fruits, and golden pastries, but the sight of it only heightened Sarah's discomfort. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and the faint metallic scent from the night before lingered. Sarah forced a polite smile and sat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She picked at her food, her appetite smothered by the oppressive atmosphere. Victor, however, ate with relish, his every move deliberate, as though he were savoring not just the meal but the unease that radiated from her. "You seem tense," he remarked, his sharp gaze cutting into her. "Adjusting to your new home can be challenging, I'm sure." "Yes," Sarah replied, her voice tight. "It's very different from what I'm used to," Victor chuckled softly, the sound sending a shiver down her spine. "You'll find that Black Hollow has its own unique charm." His words hung in the air like a veiled threat, and Sarah felt her pulse quicken. She wanted to ask what he meant, to demand answers about the strange occurrences and the fear that gnawed at her, but something in his demeanor warned her to stay silent. Later that day, Sarah wandered the halls of the mansion, her unease growing with every passing moment. The servants moved like shadows, their faces blank and their footsteps eerily silent. The oppressive quiet was broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards or the distant echo of footsteps. As she passed a heavy wooden door slightly ajar, she heard voices low, conspiratorial tones that stopped her in her tracks. Her heart pounded as she recognized Victor's voice, smooth and commanding, but laced with an edge of malice. "She's here," Victor said, his words chilling in their simplicity. "The Westwoods will come, just as planned." A second voice responded, gravelly and dripping with menace. "And the girl? Does she suspect anything?" "She's too naive," Victor replied with a dismissive laugh. "She's nothing more than bait. By the time her family realizes what's happening, it will be too late." Sarah's blood ran cold. She pressed herself against the wall, her breathing shallow, her mind racing. Bait. The word echoed in her head like a death knell. This marriage wasn't a union, it was a trap. Victor had lured her family here for reasons far more sinister than she could have imagined. The cloaked figure spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "They will fall, one by one. And when the Westwoods are gone, the Harlows will rise." Victor's response was cold and final. "Ensure everything is in place. Tonight we begin." Sarah's legs felt weak, her body trembling as she stumbled away from the door. She wanted to run, to scream, but fear paralyzed her. Her mind was a whirlwind of panic and desperation. "What have I done?" she thought, tears stinging her eyes. "I've brought my family into a nightmare." She retreated to her chambers, bolting the door behind her. Her breaths came in ragged gasps as she tried to process what she had overheard. Victor's charm, the elaborate ceremony, the eerie mansion, it had all been a facade. He had never intended for this to be a true marriage. She was nothing more than a pawn in a cruel, deadly game. Grief and guilt consumed her as she thought of her father, her mother, and her younger brother Thomas. They had come here to support her, to honor what they believed was a joyous occasion. Instead, they were walking straight into the jaws of danger. Sarah's thoughts turned to the faint hope of escape. Could she warn her family? Could she convince them to leave before it was too late? Her heart ached at the thought of Edward's worn face, his quiet pleas for her to reconsider. He had known. He had sensed the darkness that surrounded the Harlows. And now, she had to face the consequences of ignoring his warnings. As the day dragged on, the atmosphere in the mansion grew even darker. The servants avoided her gaze entirely now, their movements more hurried, as though they were preparing for something they dared not speak of. Sarah's every step was weighed down by the knowledge of what was to come. That evening, she stood by the window of her room, staring out at the sprawling grounds. The mist had thickened, swallowing the landscape in an impenetrable haze. Somewhere beyond the trees, a wolf howled a long, mournful sound that seemed to echo her despair. A knock at the door startled her, and she spun around, her pulse racing. It was Anna, the maid, her pale face illuminated by the flickering light of a lantern. "You shouldn't be here," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Anna hesitated before stepping inside, her expression grim. "I had to warn you," she said, her voice low. "Tonight, something terrible is going to happen. You need to stay hidden." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes as she grasped Anna's arm. "My family," she pleaded. "They're in danger. I have to warn them." Anna shook her head fiercely. "It's too late. They won't listen. Victor has already ensured that they won't leave." Sarah's knees buckled, and she sank onto the edge of the bed. "Then what can I do?" she asked, her voice breaking. "I can't just let them die." Anna's expression softened, a flicker of pity breaking through her fear. "You have to survive," she said simply. "If you die, all hope for the Westwoods dies with you." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Sarah felt a growing sense of dread. The mansion was unnervingly quiet, as though it were holding its breath. She could feel the weight of Victor's plan bearing down on her, the enormity of the trap that had been set. Her fingers brushed against the silver locket around her neck, a gift from her father on the day of her engagement. Inside was a small picture of her family, their faces smiling with love and hope. It was a cruel reminder of the happiness that had been stolen from them. A single thought burned in her mind as she prepared for the night ahead: I will not let him win. The storm was coming, and Sarah would have to face it head on. Part 4. The demonic ambush. The air was heavy that night, thick with a suffocating tension that settled over the Harlow estate like a dark shroud. The once muted glow of the moon seemed to dim entirely, leaving the grounds bathed in a sinister twilight. A deathly silence hung over the mansion, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves outside. Yet to Sarah, even the faintest sound carried an ominous weight, as though the night itself were alive and breathing in anticipation. She stood by her window, trembling hands clutching the edge of the sill. Her gaze wandered to the distant tree line, now cloaked in an impenetrable mist. Somewhere out there, her family was being led into a trap, a realization that churned her stomach and made her knees weak. She could barely comprehend what Victor had orchestrated, but the sense of impending doom was undeniable. A faint knock at the door startled her, and she spun around, her heart pounding. It was Anna again, her face pale and drenched in sweat. "They're coming," Anna whispered, her voice trembling. "You need to stay here. Lock the door and don't let anyone in. No matter what you hear." Sarah stepped forward, desperation clawing at her throat. "My family," she said, her voice breaking. "They're in danger. I have to warn them." Anna grabbed her shoulders, her grip surprisingly strong. "It's too late. They won't listen, and if you go out there, you'll die too." Tears welled in Anna's eyes as she added, "Please, if you want to survive, do as I say." But Sarah shook her head fiercely, pulling away. "I can't just hide while they're being slaughtered. I need to." Her voice faltered as a chilling sound echoed from the distance, a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the walls. Anna froze, her eyes wide with terror. "They're here," she whispered. Then, without another word, she turned and fled, leaving Sarah standing alone in the suffocating darkness of her room. Moments later, chaos erupted. The first screams tore through the night, shrill and agonized, followed by the unmistakable sounds of breaking glass and splintering wood. Sarah's blood ran cold as she rushed to the window, her breath hitching at the sight below. The estate grounds were a scene of unimaginable horror. Dark shapes moved swiftly through the mist, grotesque, inhuman figures with elongated limbs and glowing red eyes. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, as though their bodies were held together by something other than flesh and bone. They descended upon the house like a swarm, their guttural growls and gutted screeches echoing into the night. Sarah's hands flew to her mouth as she spotted her father, Edward, and her younger brother Thomas, standing near the main entrance. Edward held a makeshift weapon, a thick branch he must have grabbed from the garden, and Thomas brandished a fire poker. Their faces were pale but determined, their bodies trembling with the effort to stand their ground. "Father," Sarah cried out, her voice muffled by the glass. She pounded on the window, but the noise was swallowed by the chaos below. Edward swung his branch wildly, striking one of the creatures that lunged at him. The blow landed with a sickening crack, but the creature barely flinched. Its distorted face twisted into something resembling a grin before it lashed out, its claws raking across Edward's arm. He stumbled but didn't fall, his resolve unwavering. Thomas, meanwhile, fought with the desperation of youth. He jabbed at another creature with the fire poker, managing to drive it back a few steps. But the victory was short-lived. A third demon emerged from the mist, its claws swiping at Thomas's leg and sending him crashing to the ground. "No," Sarah screamed, tears streaming down her face. She wanted to run to them, to throw herself into the fray and protect the people she loved, but her legs refused to move. She was paralyzed by fear, her body frozen as she watched the nightmare unfold. Inside the mansion, the battle was just as brutal. The doors burst open, and the creatures poured in, their twisted forms moving with terrifying speed. The few remaining servants screamed as they tried to flee, but the demons showed no mercy. Blood splattered the walls as the creatures tore through their victims with savage efficiency. Victor appeared at the top of the grand staircase, a smug smile on his face as he watched the carnage unfold. He looked completely unbothered, his hands clasped behind his back as though he were enjoying a theatrical performance. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said, his voice carrying over the din of screams and destruction. Sarah turned to face him, her hands balled into fists. "You did this," she spat, her voice trembling with rage. "You lured them here." Victor raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. "Oh, my dear," he said with mock concern. "Surely you understand by now. This was never about you. Your family is nothing more than a means to an end. Their suffering is collateral damage." His words ignited a fire in Sarah's chest, and she took a step toward him. "You're a monster," she hissed. Victor chuckled darkly. "Perhaps. But monsters have their uses." Before Sarah could respond, a deafening crash shook the mansion. One of the demons had broken through a window on the upper floor and was now stalking toward her, its glowing eyes fixed hungrily on her trembling form. Victor stepped aside, his expression smug. "Good luck, my dear," he said, before disappearing into the shadows. Sarah's instincts screamed at her to run, but her feet refused to move. The demon crept closer, its grotesque form illuminated by the flickering light of a nearby candelabra. Its claws glinted menacingly as it snarled, saliva dripping from its jagged teeth. Just as it leapt toward her, a figure barreled into it from the side. It was Thomas, his face bloodied but his eyes blazing with determination. He swung the fire poker with all his strength, driving the creature back. "Sarah, go," he shouted, his voice hoarse. "Get out of here." But Sarah couldn't leave. Not when her family was fighting for their lives. She grabbed a nearby candlestick and raised it like a weapon, her hands shaking but her resolve firm. "I'm not leaving you," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her. The demon recovered quickly, lunging at Thomas again. He dodged, but not fast enough. Its claws raked across his side, drawing a cry of pain. Sarah screamed and rushed forward, swinging the candlestick with all her might. The heavy brass connected with the creature's head, and it let out an ear-piercing shriek before retreating slightly. For a brief moment, the siblings stood together, their breathing ragged as they prepared for the next attack. But the demons kept coming, their numbers seemingly endless. Edward appeared in the doorway, blood streaming down his arm, his face pale but determined. "We have to get out of here," he said, his voice urgent. "Sarah, Thomas, go now." The words barely registered before a piercing scream echoed from outside Sarah's mother. Sarah's heart shattered as she realized the truth: there was no escape. The Harlows had ensured that every path was blocked, every exit a trap. As the demons closed in, Sarah's world became a blur of chaos, blood, and heartbreak. Her family fought with everything they had, but the onslaught was too much. One by one they fell, their screams echoing in her mind like a haunting melody she would never forget. In the end, Sarah was left alone, her body trembling and her soul shattered. The Harlow estate stood eerily quiet once more, but the silence was worse than the chaos. It was the silence of death. Part 5. The Betrayal. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood and the acrid stench of burning wood. The once grand halls of the Harlow estate now bore the scars of the night's carnage, shattered windows, splintered furniture, and walls streaked with crimson. Somewhere in the mansion, the echoes of screams still lingered, though they were fewer now, quieter. The slaughter was nearly complete. Sarah stood in the center of the grand ballroom, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Her gown was torn, her bare arms streaked with blood, some hers, some not. Her chest heaved as she clutched the broken remnants of a candlestick, her only weapon. The oppressive silence pressed down on her like a weight, broken only by the slow, deliberate footsteps of the man she now knew as her captor. Victor emerged from the shadows at the far end of the room, his once handsome face twisted into a smirk that sent chills down Sarah's spine. His suit was immaculate, untouched by the violence that had consumed the rest of the estate. He moved with an unnerving calmness, his dark eyes glinting with amusement. "Well," he began, his voice smooth and venomous. "You've lasted longer than I expected." Sarah raised the candlestick, her grip tightening despite the trembling in her hands. "Stay back," she warned, though her voice cracked with fear. Victor stopped a few paces away, his expression unreadable. Then, he tilted his head and chuckled a low, guttural sound that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. "Do you really think that will save you?" he asked, nodding toward her makeshift weapon. "You're clever, Sarah, but you're still human." The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Human. Mortal. Weak. Sarah's stomach churned as Victor's gaze bore into her, his eyes darker now, almost black. "Why?" she demanded, her voice trembling with anger and despair. "Why are you doing this? You tricked my family into coming here. What have we ever done to you?" Victor's smirk widened, his teeth glinting unnaturally in the dim light. "Oh, my dear, you misunderstand," he said, his tone dripping with mock pity. "This isn't personal. You and your family were simply necessary." Necessary? Sarah's voice broke. Tears streamed down her face as she took a step back, her legs shaking. "You murdered them. You destroyed everything." For what? Victor sighed, as though explaining something to a child. "For power." "Of course," he said simply. "Your family's bloodline carries something unique, something ancient. And with your sacrifice, the Harlow family will finally ascend." As he spoke, his form began to change. His skin darkened, taking on a sickly gray hue, and his once perfect features twisted into something grotesque. His eyes glowed a fiery red, and jagged horns sprouted from his head. His smile revealed sharp, glistening teeth, and his fingers elongated into clawed talons. Sarah staggered backward, her heart pounding. The man she had married was gone, replaced by a creature from her worst nightmares. What are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Victor spread his arms wide, as if basking in her horror. "I am what I've always been," he said. "A demon. And you, my dear, are the final piece of the puzzle. Your blood will open the gates, and the Harlow family will reign supreme, immortal, and unstoppable." Sarah's vision blurred with tears as she realized the full extent of his betrayal. She thought of her father, her brother, her mother, all gone now, their lives snuffed out in a night of unimaginable violence. And for what? To feed Victor's insatiable hunger for power? "No," she said, her voice trembling but firm. She straightened, gripping the candlestick like a lifeline. "You won't take me. You won't win." Victor laughed, the sound echoing through the ruined ballroom. "And how do you plan to stop me?" he asked mockingly. "You're alone, Sarah. There's no one left to save you." But Sarah wasn't ready to give up. She remembered her father's words, spoken with quiet desperation the night they arrived. "Stay strong. Don't let them break you." The memory ignited something within her, a spark of defiance, a refusal to let Victor's monstrous plans succeed. "I don't need anyone to save me," she said, her voice stronger now. "I'll save myself." Victor's grin faltered, just for a moment. Then his expression darkened, his eyes narrowing. "So be it," he snarled. "Let's see how long your courage lasts." With a deafening roar, he lunged at her, his claws slashing through the air. Sarah dove to the side, narrowly avoiding his attack. She scrambled to her feet, her heart racing as she tried to put distance between them. Victor moved with terrifying speed, his inhuman form a blur as he pursued her. Sarah swung the candlestick wildly, striking him across the face. The blow barely fazed him, but it gave her enough time to dart toward the shattered remnants of a nearby table. She grabbed a jagged piece of wood, her hands slick with sweat and blood. "You're only delaying the inevitable," Victor growled, his voice distorted and inhuman. "You can't win." "Sarah, maybe not," she shot back, her chest heaving. "But I can make you bleed." With a surge of adrenaline, she charged at him, driving the splintered wood into his side. Victor howled in pain, his claws lashing out blindly. One struck her arm, sending a searing pain through her body, but she held her ground. The fight was brutal and chaotic, a desperate struggle between predator and prey. Sarah's movements were fueled by sheer willpower, her every breath a defiance of the fear threatening to consume her. She managed to land another blow, the sharp wood sinking into Victor's shoulder. He roared, his eyes blazing with fury. "You'll regret that," he hissed, his voice dripping with malice. But Sarah didn't back down. "You've taken everything from me," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "I won't let you take my life too." Victor lunged again, but this time Sarah was ready. She dodged his claws and grabbed a nearby candelabra, swinging it with all her strength. The heavy metal struck his head, and he stumbled, momentarily disoriented. Sarah took the opportunity to run, her bare feet slipping on the blood-soaked floor. She didn't know where she was going, only that she needed to get away. Her heart pounded in her chest as she darted through the darkened halls, her breath ragged and shallow. Behind her, Victor's roar echoed, shaking the very walls of the mansion. "You can't escape me, Sarah," he bellowed. "This is my domain." She burst into a small room, slamming the door shut behind her. Her hands fumbled with the lock, her body trembling as she pressed her back against the door. Her gaze darted around the room, searching for anything she could use to defend herself. A faint glimmer of light caught her eye, a silver dagger resting on a nearby table. It looked ancient, its blade inscribed with strange symbols that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. Without hesitation, she grabbed it, the cool metal reassuring in her hands. The door shook violently as Victor pounded on it, his snarls growing louder. "You can't hide forever," he growled. "Your blood belongs to me." Sarah tightened her grip on the dagger, her resolve hardening. She knew she couldn't outrun him forever. If she was going to survive, she had to fight. And this time she would make sure he didn't get back up. As the door splintered and Victor burst into the room, Sarah raised the dagger, her eyes blazing with determination. "You want my blood," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "Come and take it." With a scream that was equal parts rage and defiance, she charged at him, the blade gleaming in the flickering light. If this was her end, she would make sure he remembered it. Part 6. A desperate defiance. The room was plunged into chaos, the air thick with the acrid scent of blood and the ear-splitting roars of the demonic horde. Sarah's chest heaved as she crouched in the shadows, her trembling fingers clutching the silver dagger her father had pressed into her hand before they entered the Harlow estate. She remembered his urgent whisper, the desperation in his eyes. "Keep this close, Sarah. It's the only thing that can end this nightmare." At the time, she hadn't understood his words. Now, as Victor's guttural laughter echoed through the ruins of the grand ballroom, she knew her father had foreseen this moment. The dagger felt impossibly small in her grip, yet its weight was the only anchor against her spiraling fear. Victor, his demonic form towering and grotesque, stood at the center of the room. His fiery eyes burned with cruel delight as he surveyed the destruction he had unleashed. Around him, the demons snarled and snapped at each other, their unity held together only by the force of his will. "You've lost, Sarah," Victor growled, his voice reverberating through the shattered hall. Your family is gone. Your fight is meaningless. Accept your fate, and I promise to make your end swift. Sarah's breath hitched, her mind racing. She could feel her heart pounding against her ribcage, every beat screaming at her to run, to hide. But there was nowhere to go. Victor's gaze pierced the shadows, and she knew it was only a matter of time before he found her. Her eyes darted to the silver dagger, its blade catching the faint glow of the moonlight filtering through the broken windows. The strange runes engraved along its surface seemed to shimmer, as though alive. This was her last chance. If she failed, there would be no escape, not for her, not for anyone. Summoning every ounce of courage, Sarah stepped out from the shadows. Her legs felt like lead, but her grip on the dagger tightened. "You're wrong, Victor," she said, her voice trembling but defiant. "This isn't over." Victor's eyes snapped to her, his twisted smile widening. "Ah, the bride returns," he sneered. "Come to join the rest of your pathetic family in oblivion." Sarah didn't answer. Instead, she began to move, circling him slowly, keeping the dagger hidden behind her back. Victor tilted his head, his amusement turning to curiosity. "What are you planning, little human?" he asked mockingly. "Do you think you can stop me?" As he spoke, Sarah's mind raced. She knew she couldn't overpower him, not directly. She needed to catch him off guard, to strike where he least expected. Her father's words echoed in her mind. The dagger must pierce his heart. It's the only way. The demons around Victor began to shift, their glowing eyes narrowing as they sensed her defiance. Their guttural growls filled the air, but they didn't move, not yet. Victor raised a clawed hand, silencing them with a gesture. "Stand down," he ordered, his voice dripping with confidence. "This one is mine." Sarah's pulse quickened. This was her chance. With a sudden burst of speed, she lunged forward, the dagger flashing in the moonlight. Victor's eyes widened in shock, and for the first time, Sarah saw something she hadn't thought possible: fear. The blade struck true, sinking into his chest with a sickening crunch. A deafening roar erupted from Victor as he staggered backward, clutching at the dagger embedded in his heart. His monstrous form convulsed, and the fiery glow in his eyes flickered like a dying flame. "No," he bellowed, his voice raw with fury and pain. "What have you done?" Sarah stumbled back, her chest heaving as she watched him writhe. The dagger pulsed with an unnatural light, the runes along its blade glowing brighter with every passing second. The demons surrounding Victor froze, their snarls turning to confused whimpers. The unity that had bound them together began to fracture. One by one, they turned on each other, their once synchronized movements devolving into chaotic violence. Claws tore through flesh, fangs snapped at throats, and the ballroom erupted into a frenzy of demonic infighting. Sarah could barely comprehend what was happening. The dagger had done more than wound Victor, it had shattered his control over the horde. The very foundation of his power was crumbling before her eyes. Victor fell to one knee, his claws grasping at the dagger as if to pull it free. But the more he struggled, the deeper it seemed to burrow into his chest. His roars grew weaker, his form flickering between human and demon. "You insolent wretch," he hissed, his voice barely audible. "You think this changes anything? You think you've won?" Sarah stepped forward, her fear replaced by a surge of determination. "I don't care about winning," she said, her voice steady. "I care about stopping you." Victor's eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw something she hadn't expected: desperation. He reached out toward her, his claws trembling, but the light from the dagger flared, forcing him back. The demons continued to tear each other apart, their blood staining the already ruined ballroom. The air was thick with the stench of sulfur and the sounds of battle. Sarah knew she didn't have much time. Victor was weakened, but he wasn't finished. If she didn't act now, he might recover, and she wouldn't survive a second confrontation. As she approached, Victor's form flickered again, his monstrous features softening into something almost human. "Sarah," he rasped, his voice suddenly tender, almost pleading. "Please, don't do this. You don't understand what's at stake." Sarah hesitated, her grip on the dagger tightening. The face before her was the one she had married, the one that had smiled at her so convincingly. For a moment, doubt crept into her mind. Could she truly end this? Could she kill the man who, despite everything, had once seemed so human? But then she remembered her family, their screams, their blood, their faces twisted in agony. This was no man. This was a monster who had taken everything from her. She couldn't afford to hesitate. "No," she said, her voice firm. "You don't understand. This ends now." With a surge of strength, Sarah grasped the hilt of the dagger and twisted it deeper. Victor's scream was deafening, a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mansion. His body convulsed violently, and the light from the dagger exploded outward, engulfing the room in a blinding radiance. When the light faded, Victor was gone. The demons, too, had vanished, their fractured unity unable to withstand the loss of their master. The ballroom was eerily silent, the only sound Sarah's ragged breathing. She fell to her knees, her body trembling as the weight of what had happened finally hit her. Tears streamed down her face as she clutched the dagger, its once glowing blade now dull and lifeless. Her family was gone. The Harlow estate was in ruins. But she was alive. She had survived. And for the first time, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to rebuild. Part 7. The fiery escape. The air inside the Harlow mansion was suffocating, thick with smoke and the stench of sulfur. Flames licked at the ornate woodwork, consuming the once grand estate in a blazing inferno. Shadows writhed along the walls, cast by the firelight, as though the very house was alive and desperate to devour everything within it. Sarah stood in the middle of the collapsing grand hall, her body trembling from exhaustion and pain. Her torn gown clung to her sweat-soaked skin, and the silver dagger still felt heavy in her hand, though its light had faded. The oppressive heat pressed against her chest, each breath a battle against the searing air. Behind her, the echoes of chaos lingered: Victor's guttural screams, the furious snarls of the demons, and the sickening sound of flesh being torn apart. The mansion was a battleground, no longer it was a tomb. She had struck the fatal blow that shattered Victor's control and brought the infernal horde to ruin, but now the house itself seemed to be turning on her, as if exacting revenge for its master. A deafening crack shook the room, and a burning beam crashed down mere feet from where she stood. The impact sent shards of wood and embers flying, some landing on her bare arms. She winced as the hot ash seared her skin, but she couldn't stop. The building was collapsing around her, and every second she lingered brought her closer to death. Her legs screamed in protest as she stumbled toward the doorway. The jagged floorboards bit into her bare feet, each step leaving a trail of blood behind her. She didn't care. Her only thought was to escape, to get out before the fire consumed her along with the cursed memories of the Harlow estate. The once familiar hallways were now a maze of flames and debris. The ornate tapestries that had lined the walls were reduced to smoldering scraps, and the chandeliers overhead rained molten glass. Every turn brought fresh obstacles, and the relentless heat sapped her strength. But Sarah pushed forward, fueled by sheer will, and the memory of her father's dying words: "Survive, Sarah. You must survive." As she neared the grand staircase, another explosion of wood and flame erupted above her. A massive chunk of the ceiling gave way, crashing to the floor and blocking her path. She froze, her chest tightening as panic clawed at her throat. The fire roared hungrily, closing in on her from all sides. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. Her voice cracked, barely audible over the deafening blaze. "I won't die here." She turned and spotted a narrow side corridor, partially obscured by smoke. It was her only chance. Without hesitation, she darted into it, coughing as the acrid air burned her lungs. The corridor was dark and claustrophobic, the walls closing in as if the house itself were alive and determined to trap her. Her vision blurred, tears streaming from her smoke-stung eyes. Her breaths came in shallow gasps, each one harder to draw than the last. The edges of her consciousness wavered, threatening to pull her into oblivion. But she wouldn't stop. Not when freedom was so close. Finally, she burst through a side door and into the cool night air. The sudden change was jarring. The oppressive heat was replaced by the biting chill of the forest. She stumbled forward, her legs giving out as she collapsed onto the damp ground. For a moment she lay there, her body trembling with exhaustion and relief. But the respite was short-lived. Behind her, the mansion burned like a beacon of destruction, the flames reaching high into the night sky. The crackling of the fire was punctuated by the occasional groan of collapsing walls and the distant howls of the remaining demons. The sight was both mesmerizing and horrifying, a symbol of all she had lost and the nightmare she had narrowly escaped. Sarah forced herself to her feet, her body protesting with every movement. The cool earth felt rough against her injured feet, but she barely noticed. Her mind was consumed by a single thought: she had to keep moving. The Harlow estate might be burning, but the danger wasn't over. Not yet. The forest loomed before her, dark and foreboding. The twisted branches of ancient trees reached out like skeletal hands, their shadows dancing in the flickering light of the fire. Sarah hesitated for only a moment before plunging into the woods. The undergrowth scratched at her legs, and the uneven ground threatened to trip her with every step. But she pressed on. Her thoughts were a chaotic whirlwind. Images of her family flashed before her eyes: her father's stern but loving gaze, her mother's quiet smile, Thomas's youthful determination. They were gone now, victims of Victor's monstrous plans. Guilt stabbed at her chest, sharp and unrelenting. If only I had listened. If only I had seen the signs sooner. But guilt wouldn't bring them back, and dwelling on it wouldn't save her now. She had to focus on surviving for them, if not for herself. The forest was eerily silent, the usual sounds of nocturnal life absent. Even the wind seemed to have stilled, as though the world itself were holding its breath. Sarah's every step echoed unnaturally, the crack of twigs beneath her feet sounding far too loud in the oppressive quiet. Then, from somewhere behind her, she heard a faint rustling, barely audible over the pounding of her own heart. She froze, her body tensing as she strained to listen. The sound came again, closer this time, accompanied by the unmistakable crunch of leaves. Her blood ran cold. She wasn't alone. She turned, her eyes scanning the darkness. The fire from the mansion cast a faint glow on the edge of the forest, but it did little to penetrate the shadows. Every twisted branch and shifting leaf seemed to take on a life of its own, and Sarah's imagination filled in the gaps with horror she could barely comprehend. "Who's there?" she called, her voice shaking. The only answer was silence. Panic set in as the rustling grew louder, more deliberate. Sarah clutched the dagger tightly, its hilt slick with sweat. Her heart raced and her breath came in shallow gasps. She had thought the worst was over, but now she realized the forest held its own terrors. A shadow moved at the edge of her vision, darting between the trees. She spun around, the dagger raised, but there was nothing there. The oppressive quiet returned, but it did nothing to calm her nerves. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs felt rooted to the ground. Then, a low growl rumbled from the darkness. It was deep and guttural, vibrating through the still night air. Sarah's blood turned to ice as the sound grew closer, accompanied by the snapping of branches and the heavy thud of footsteps. She turned and ran. Her feet pounded against the forest floor, each step sending jolts of pain through her battered body. The growling followed her, growing louder, more insistent. She didn't dare look back, terrified of what she might see. The shadows seemed to close in around her, the trees twisting and bending as if trying to trap her. Her lungs burned and her legs threatened to give out, but she forced herself to keep going. She couldn't stop now, not when survival was within reach. She had to believe there was an end to this forest, a place where she could find safety. Finally, she burst into a small clearing, the moonlight illuminating her tear-streaked face. She collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath. The growling had stopped, but she didn't trust the silence. Her eyes darted around the clearing, searching for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just the wind, which had finally returned, rustling the leaves above her. For the first time since the nightmare began, Sarah allowed herself to cry. The sobs racked her body, releasing the fear, the pain, and the overwhelming grief she had been holding back. She was alive, but at what cost? Her family was gone. The Harlow estate was in ruins, and the future stretched out before her as a vast, uncertain void. Yet even in her despair, a small spark of determination remained. She had survived the Harlows, the demons, and the fire. She had fought against impossible odds and lived to tell the tale. And as she wiped the tears from her face and stood once more, she vowed to honor the memory of her family. No matter what lay ahead, she would keep moving. She would survive. For them. Part 8. A father's final words. The forest was eerily silent. The kind of silence that pressed against Sarah's ears and made her acutely aware of every breath she took. Her lungs burned, her legs felt like lead, and her bare feet were raw from running over jagged rocks and sharp twigs. The moonlight barely pierced the dense canopy above, leaving her surrounded by shifting shadows and unseen terrors. Sarah collapsed to her knees in a small clearing, her chest heaving as she gasped for air. The silver dagger, its blade dull now, but still warm from the infernal battle, slipped from her trembling hand. Tears streamed down her face, hot and unrelenting, as the weight of everything crashed over her. Her family was gone, her father, her mother, and her brother, Thomas. The Harlow estate, once towering and oppressive, now lay in fiery ruins behind her. But the images of that night, the blood, the screams, the betrayal were etched into her mind. She couldn't escape them, couldn't run far enough to leave them behind. Suddenly, a voice rose from the depths of her memory, clear and resolute despite the chaos that had surrounded it. Her father's voice never stopped running. She froze, the sound of his words cutting through her despair like a blade. It had been his final plea, spoken with his last breath as the demons tore into him. She had watched him fall, his blood pooling beneath him, as he used his body to shield Thomas for a few precious seconds longer. In that moment, Sarah had wanted to die. She had wanted to throw herself into the fray, to fight alongside them, to perish with her family, rather than live in a world without them. But Edward's voice, stern and commanding even in his final moments, had stopped her. Run, Sarah. Never stop running, and she had obeyed, though every step away from them had felt like a betrayal. The memory of her father's words filled her now, mingling with the ache of loss and the bitter taste of guilt. She pressed her hands to her face, stifling a sob, as she tried to make sense of it all. Why had he told her to run? Why hadn't he begged her to fight, to stay, to die with them? But deep down, she knew the answer. Edward had always been a pragmatic man, a pillar of strength in their family. He had seen what she couldn't in that moment, that staying would mean certain death, not just for her, but for the hope of ending the Harlow curse. You must survive, he had told her earlier that evening, his voice low but urgent as they prepared for the ceremony. No matter what happens, Sarah, you have to live. There's more at stake here than just our family. Promise me you'll fight to the end. Sarah hadn't understood then. She had thought he was simply being dramatic, overwhelmed by the strangeness of the Harlows and their dark, decaying estate. Now, though, his meaning was painfully clear. She was the last Westwood standing. Her survival wasn't just for her own sake, it was the only way to stop the horrors that the Harlows had unleashed upon the world. Wiping her tears, Sarah forced herself to her feet. Her legs wobbled beneath her, and her vision blurred from exhaustion, but she refused to collapse. Edward's voice echoed in her mind like a lifeline, urging her forward. Never stop running, she whispered aloud, her voice hoarse but determined. The dagger felt heavy in her hand as she picked it up once more. Its weight reminded her of everything she had lost, but also of what she still had to fight for. The blade was no longer glowing, the runes etched into its surface now faint and unreadable, but she knew its power hadn't faded entirely. It had been her father's last gift to her, his final hope for their family's survival. As she stumbled deeper into the forest, the night seemed to close in around her. The trees creaked and groaned, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent a jolt of fear through her, but she kept moving. Fear was her companion now, a constant presence that pushed her forward even as it threatened to paralyze her. Hours passed, or perhaps it was only minutes. Time had lost all meaning. The forest seemed endless, an unyielding maze of shadows and hidden dangers. Sarah's body ached, every step a test of her resolve. But, with each stride, her father's voice grew louder in her mind, drowning out the fear and exhaustion. She began to think of her family not as she had seen them that night, but as they had been before. Her father sitting by the fireplace, his stern face softening as he shared stories of their ancestors. her mother humming softly in the kitchen, her hands deftly kneading dough for the bread they all loved. Thomas, always full of energy, teasing her about her daydreams but fiercely protective when it mattered most. These memories weren't just painful reminders of what she had lost, they were her strength. They were the reason she had to keep going, to find a way to end the Harlow curse so that no other family would have to suffer as hers had. As dawn began to break, the forest thinned, and Sarah stumbled into a clearing. The first rays of sunlight pierced through the mist, casting the world in soft hues of gold and pink. It was a stark contrast to the nightmare she had endured, and for a moment she simply stood there, bathed in the light, as though trying to absorb its warmth. She fell to her knees again, her body finally giving out. The dagger slipped from her hand, landing in the dirt beside her. She stared at it, her mind racing with the weight of her father's final words. "Never stop running," she murmured again, her voice cracking. But now, those words took on a new meaning. Running wasn't just about escaping, it was about surviving. It was about finding a way to fight back, to honor her family's sacrifice by ensuring it hadn't been in vain. She closed her eyes, letting the sunlight wash over her as a fresh wave of tears spilled down her cheeks. But this time they weren't just tears of sorrow. They were tears of determination, of resolve. Edward's voice wasn't just a memory, it was her guiding star, the thread that would lead her out of the darkness. When Sarah finally opened her eyes, her gaze fell on the dagger. She picked it up, gripping it tightly. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a symbol of her family's strength, their love, and their enduring legacy. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she knew one thing for certain: she would keep running, not out of fear, but toward the end of the Harlow curse. With the rising sun at her back, Sarah pushed herself to her feet and began to walk. Her steps were slow and unsteady, but they carried her forward. She was battered, broken, and grieving, but she was alive. And as long as she lived, she would fight. For her father. For her family. For the future. Part 9. The Haunting Promise. The forest was still, its silence eerie and unnatural. The faint light of dawn barely touched the twisted trees, their gnarled branches casting long, skeletal shadows across the ground. Sarah leaned against the rough bark of an old oak, her chest heaving as she struggled to catch her breath. The cool air stung her lungs, a sharp contrast to the oppressive heat of the inferno she had fled. Behind her, the Harlow Manor burned like a cursed beacon. Flames licked the sky, their crackling roar carrying across the forest. The glow illuminated the twisted canopy above, casting fleeting shadows that seemed to writhe and twist like living things. Sarah's bloodied hands trembled as she clutched the silver dagger, its once vivid runes now faded and cold. She wanted to believe it was over, that the fire consuming the mansion had also consumed the evil that dwelled within it. That Victor and his monstrous horde were gone for good, but the weight in her chest told her otherwise. There was a lingering darkness in the air, an invisible presence that seemed to press against her skin, cold and suffocating. As she pushed herself upright, her ears caught the faintest sound, a whisper, low and guttural, carried on the wind. It was barely audible, yet it froze her in place, her breath hitching as a chill ran down her spine. "This isn't over," the words hung in the air, their menace palpable. Sarah's grip tightened on the dagger, her knuckles white. She turned sharply, her eyes scanning the dense forest for any sign of movement. The shadows seemed deeper now, darker, as though the trees themselves were conspiring to conceal whatever horror lurked within them. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling but defiant. The only response was the faint rustle of leaves and the distant crackle of the burning manor. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat a reminder of how fragile her life had become. The whisper came again, closer this time. It was a voice that didn't belong to any human, throat wet and rasping, like the sound of air being forced through shattered lungs. "You think it's over, child?" It mocked. This is only the beginning. Sarah's mind raced, fear clawing at her from all sides. She had seen Victor die. She had driven the dagger into his heart, watched as the light left his demonic eyes. The manor was collapsing, its infernal inhabitants destroyed in the chaos. Yet the voice, Victor's voice, was unmistakable. No, she whispered to herself, shaking her head. You're dead. I killed you. Did you? The voice taunted, a cruel laugh rumbling through the shadows. You've only delayed the inevitable. The Harlow bloodline cannot be extinguished so easily. Sarah's legs threatened to buckle beneath her, but she forced herself to stand firm. Her father's words echoed in her mind, never stop running, but she couldn't run now. Not yet. Not while the darkness still pursued her. A figure emerged from the shadows, faint and translucent, like smoke caught in a phantom wind. It was Victor, or what was left of him. His form flickered, shifting between his human visage and the grotesque demon she had fought in the manor. His fiery eyes, now dim and hollow, fixed on her with a predatory gleam. You're not real, Sarah said, her voice trembling. You're just a ghost. Victor's spectral form laughed, the sound reverberating through the forest like the tolling of a death knell. A ghost. Perhaps, he said, his voice a chilling blend of amusement and malice. But even a ghost can leave scars. He stepped closer, his form gliding over the forest floor. Sarah's instinct screamed at her to flee, but her feet refused to move. She raised the dagger, its weight reassuring in her hand, though she had no idea if it would work against whatever Victor had become. Stay back, she shouted, her voice cracking. Victor paused, his flickering form swaying like a flame in the wind. Do you really think you've won? He asked. The dagger may have severed my connection to this world, but the curse runs deeper than you can comprehend. It binds us, Sarah. You cannot escape it. Tears welled in her eyes as she gritted her teeth. You're lying, she spat. The curse ends with you. The manor is gone. Your demons are gone. There's nothing left. Victor's expression darkened, his features twisting into something grotesque. Foolish girl, he hissed. The curse is not bound to a house or a name. It is bound to blood. As long as your veins carry the Westwood legacy, the curse will persist. The weight of his words crushed her, stealing the breath from her lungs. She had survived the horrors of the Harlow estate, only to find that her very existence was a conduit for the darkness to endure. Her survival, which her father had fought so desperately for, now felt like a cruel joke. No, she whispered, shaking her head. There has to be a way to stop this. Victor's form began to fade, his laugh echoing as he dissolved into the shadows. You cannot stop it, Sarah. You can only endure it. And I will be waiting. In every shadow, in every whisper, I will haunt you until the end of time. As his presence vanished, the forest seemed to exhale, the oppressive weight lifting slightly. But the damage was done. Sarah sank to the ground, the dagger slipping from her grasp as she buried her face in her hands. Sobs racked her body, the enormity of her fate pressing down on her like an unyielding storm. She thought of her father, his dying plea for her to survive. Had he known? Had he realized that her survival would mean carrying the curse alone? The thought tore at her heart, filling her with a mix of grief and anger. For a long time she sat there, the forest around her silent once more. The flames of the burning manor had faded into the distance, leaving only the faint glow of dawn on the horizon. The world was quiet, but inside her, a storm raged. Finally, she rose to her feet, her movement slow and deliberate. She picked up the dagger, its blade glinting faintly in the morning light. It was a cruel irony that the weapon meant to end the curse now felt like her only ally. She wiped her tears, her expression hardening. The fear was still there, gnawing at the edges of her resolve, but something else had taken root, a spark of defiance, a refusal to let the darkness consume her. This isn't over, she said, echoing Victor's words. But this time they weren't a threat, they were a promise. Sarah turned and began walking, her step steady despite the ache in her body. She didn't know where she was going or what awaited her, but she knew one thing: she would keep fighting. For her family, for herself, and for the chance to one day break the curse. The forest closed in behind her, swallowing her in its shadows, and as the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees, a faint whisper carried on the wind, chilling and persistent, I will be waiting. Sarah didn't look back.